Okay, so I think I'm ready to get started. I should be able just to pause a little bit periodically if folks are joining the meeting while I'm speaking and presenting. Um, so, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining Spark Reproductive Justice Now for our Queering RJ pre conference. We're very, very excited to be presenting at our first national conference, Justice Now 2020. And yeah, I'm very, very excited to do this training, engage in the workshops. I hope y'all are excited as well. Um, and yeah, I'm really just gonna jump right in with the agenda. Okay, so we have a bit of a full, not day, but couple of hours for this workshop. I feel like I've timed it out enough so that it should fit in within the 2 hours. Either that or we'll be just shy of it. And of course, I encourage y'all to engage, interact, use the chat feature to ask questions. I believe y'all have access to the chat. Um, and yeah, we're gonna learn a lot today. So going through the agenda first, welcome and introductions, community agreements. We're going to do a reproductive justice crash course, queering queerness, queer liberation, how do we queer RJ, centering trans and GNC folks, and then we'll close with any final questions that y'all might have. So I'm going to also provide a short caveat. The info in this workshop is definitely, absolutely not everything you need to know about queering RJ, about RJ, period. RJ just 101 by itself could be a day long training. And queering RJ by itself is a days long training. So there are a lot of terms and topics I'll bring up that deserve just deeper attention and analysis, but we ain't got that time. So I hope this serves as at least a primer for you. So you can walk away having learned something new about queering RJ and about how Spark queers RJ. Um, so I'm going to, I guess, introduce myself again, first time, maybe. My name is Agbo Ekor. I'm the Director of Programs with Spark Reproductive Justice Now, and your presenter today. Pronouns are she, her, hers. Um, I'm very, very excited to be presenting this workshop, to be a part of Justice Now, of the creation and the implementation of it. A little just housekeeping. We do have an ASL interpreter who has joined us, Trisha, and then interpreter Mark McClendon. They are going to be helping interpret for us today if you have any like accessibility issues. We also have Saifa, yes, Saif has joined us as our who illustrative note taker. I can't remember what it's called, but very, very grateful to have these folks in the space. So let's get started with some community agreements. And actually, I'm not sure if y'all have access to the chat feature. If so, can y'all use it to like maybe introduce yourselves? It'll help me see if y'all like actually have access to it. And then y'all can introduce yourselves, just your name, pronouns, maybe where you're from, what organization you're representing. Okay, awesome. People are in the chat. Thank you. So yeah, please introduce yourselves. Please use this space, the chat space, as a space to ask questions. Comments, I will try to be mindful of the chat throughout the presentation. And try not to miss anyone. I will pause periodically just to give folks opportunities to ask questions, so I can just open the chat and just see the questions as they come in. That would actually be very, very helpful to me if everyone's just literally asking the questions at the same time, so I can take a pause and go through them. So yeah, glad to have y'all in the space. Let me put this on the side. Okay. All right, so we're going to start with some community agreements. So here we have our lovely community agreements for this particular space. I ask that you assume positive intent. Most folks with questions, you're probably going to utilize the question and answer feature, or the chat feature rather, which is great, awesome. I encourage you to do that. But I know it's sometimes hard to interpret tone through text. So try to keep that in mind if, while you're forming questions, or if a question, rubs you the wrong way, please assume positive intent from each other, but also recognize impact over intent. You may not have meant, how you came across, but if it really hurt someone, triggered someone, harmed someone, that's something you have to be accountable to. And I'm also not here to, traumatize anyone, as far as like, just setting the tone for my intent. But that goes into sort of our next just community agreement: call in, not out. Please just let me know if something just, if I say something that like doesn't sit right with you, that's straight out offensive, though I'm not anticipating that being an issue. You can definitely put in the chat. I think you can like even direct message me in the chat, if that's what you choose to do. Take space, make space. So if you notice that you may just be asking a lot of questions, or not, like if in the chat it's just a wall of you asking questions and not necessarily giving other folks the space to ask their questions, please be mindful of that. And then I, of course, encourage everyone to, take up space and ask questions that come up for them. There may be times, and I'm probably going to try and figure that out, where I unmute folks to ask questions. Like I said, it's kind of tricky right now being the host and presenter. So if possible, I'll unmute folks. If there's like a raise your hand feature or something like that, I'll try to unmute you so you can ask your question verbally. But if you're able to do that, please be mindful of our interpreters. Please talk clearly. I mean, you can talk normally, but just, be mindful of, I guess, your cadence and how quickly you're speaking. New folks that are joining, I'm asking everyone just to put their names, pronouns, where they're from in the chat. And then, of course, finally, you are absolutely free to leave. And I say that, as, someone who has like done this presentation before. I will not be offended or even notice it's virtual if if you leave for whatever reason, whether it's for bio needs, you just need a break. If I'm straight up boring, I won't, care if you leave the presentation or the workshop. All right, moving on. So we're going to start actually with some key terms. I'm just going to stay on this slide actually a bit, so y'all can look at the words, take them in. Um, I'm presenting this just so y'all know that there will be times, um, well, I will be defining a lot of these terms as we go through the workshop. Um, but if any term right now you just don't know what it is, you really just want to know the definition for it, please put it in the chat and I'll be happy to provide that definition. Like I said, I'm just going to sit here with this slide for a few seconds. All right. And like I said, I do intend to address um, each of these terms throughout the presentation. And if I don't, you can let me know at the end and I'll be happy to, define them for you then. Well, let's move on. So this section of the workshop is going to be just an RJ crash course. So I'm coming in with certain, I guess, assumptions that maybe folks do have some um, familiarity with reproductive justice, and you're looking to really get more information about what queering reproductive justice means. Um, I'm coming in with the assumption that folks have actually, maybe heard of reproductive justice. Um, so this part is really just going to be a relatively quick RJ review. Um, it should provide all of the useful information or a refresher that you would need to engage with this workshop. So like I said, RJ is a day-long training in and of itself. That's why I had to really work hard to condense this part of the training for RJ 101. And I'll just start with this. When we're talking about reproductive justice, we're talking about combating reproductive oppressions at a systemic level. That's really where we're just going to start and what sets reproductive justice apart from maybe other reproductive health or rights movements that you may be familiar with. So, what is reproductive oppression? So, how Spark defines reproductive oppression, it's a systems of oppression, institutional and social control, eugenics, medicalization, and violence working to uphold negative policies, practices, and cultures. And Asian communities for reproductive justice, now known as For Together in, I believe they're maybe California based. They analyzed 3 frameworks to fight reproductive oppression. What came out of that was reproductive health, reproductive rights, and then, of course, reproductive justice. And I'm going to define some of these. So we're going to start with just definition of reproductive health. So here we are. Reproductive health is a direct service framework that focuses on providing services for historically marginalized communities. This the focus is on services that provide low or no cost care, culturally competent services, access to a full range of reproductive health services, and it's care that empowers people to understand their healthcare needs. So it's not your local gyno or any doctor's office. Reproductive health organizations or spaces are specifically designed to help marginalized communities. Just going to sit with that. And then we have some major successes in reproductive health. We've seen a decline in teen pregnancy rates in states with comprehensive sex ed. Then we have reproductive technologies like IUDs and in vitro fertilization. And if folks want, if anyone can put in the chat maybe an example of a reproductive health organization. Absolutely, Planned Parenthood. Memphis Choices, I actually haven't heard of that one. Women's Fund of Omaha. Sister Love, yes, absolutely. Sister Love provides direct services to folks through STI and HIV testing, all that great stuff. Feminist Women's Health Center, as you can see from the previous slide. One World, haven't heard of that one. Oh, I'm so glad that we have people all over. Women's Community Clinic, Public Health Solutions. Awesome, awesome. So, I mean, I'm not familiar with all of these, but I'm assuming they're all reproductive health organizations if they encompass all of the things sort of on this slide. So now we're going to talk about reproductive rights as a movement. There we go. So reproductive rights uses a policy framework that, 1 second. Ooh, what is happening? Okay, there it goes. It's a policy framework that focuses on keeping abortion legal and increasing access to family planning services. So that's where you'll see the fight for, a quote unquote woman's, or how we would put it, a person with the uterus's right to choose and right to privacy. And the decision to include that very gender term, of course, woman, in this was definitely to convey how the reproductive rights movement was initially like set up. It was definitely, fight for cis women's right to choose, and right to privacy, pro-choice narrative, anti-choice narrative, things like that. They typically use either the courts or the legislature to move their movement forward, to get wins, to protect reproductive rights or access to reproductive health services. So as you can see, some of those successes include Roe v. Wade, Roe v. Wade in 1973. Of course, we all may be familiar that Roe v. Wade is currently under attack, though I can't remember a time when it wasn't under attack. We have Planned Parenthood v. Casey, which crafted the undue burden standard for abortion restrictions. And then we have Whole Woman's Health versus Hellerstedt, which states that you cannot place restrictions on abortion that create an undue burden for those seeking an abortion. So it created that undue burden standard that places had to be mindful of, or legislation rather had to be mindful of. So you can go ahead and put in the chat maybe any reproductive rights organizations you may be familiar with, and then I'm going to also open it for questions. ACLU. NARAL, absolutely. I'm not sure what CRR is. And we'll go back to Sister Song actually. Feminist Women's Law Center. That is absolutely new to me. Oh, Center for Repro Rights. Thank you. How about Planned Parenthood? They also are a reproductive rights organization. Of course, Planned Parenthood is out here, advocating for abortion or to not have abortion restrictions. They're definitely in the courts, in the legislature, pushing our issues. If, when, how, that's an interesting one. I'd actually have to think about that. Um, I may not be familiar with all of like the workings of if, when, how, but I'll have to think about that. Thank you, because I've never heard someone mention them as far as reproductive rights, but it sort of makes sense. Women's Center for Advancement in Omaha. Awesome. Oh, thank you. Thank you for that context. So, yeah, they're working to decriminalize self-managed abortion. So, yeah, that makes sense. Reproductive rights. If they're advocating whether, I guess it'd make more sense if they were in the courts. Well, they're also policy. So, in the legislature, um, it makes sense. So, thank you for that context. It really did not occur to me that that was a thing. Oh, y'all also do lawsuits. Wow. Okay. Learned something new today. And I'm like, Spark has a whole if, when, how fellow. Well, now I know. So we're going to move on. Reproductive justice. So yeah, like I said, this is really going to be a quick overview of reproductive justice. So Sister Song, they provide a definition of reproductive justice as a framework with 4 core principles. The right to bodily autonomy, right to have children, right to not have children, and right to parent the children we have. That's it. When you boil it down, that is what reproductive justice encompasses. But even though it's deceivingly, you know, simple, it encompasses a lot. And all of these rights, they're human rights, right? Reproductive justice isn't something that can be legislated away or argued away or anything like that. These are human rights that, by virtue of us being human, we have to have access to these things. Um, and RJ is about access, right? It's not necessarily about making sure things are legal, which of course helps with access, but there are systemic barriers in place that prevents people from actually accessing the services that may be legal, that may exist for folks to utilize. But if you can't afford it, if it's not in your community at all, if you don't have any transportation to access it, those are barriers. And that makes it so you can't receive the care that you want or the care that you need. You can't make these decisions about your families, your body, your lives, because you really don't have the full range of choices made available to you. So this is just a brief history of reproductive justice. Developed in 1994 during a Black Women's Caucus. So this Black Women's Caucus met right before I think it was the International Conference, yeah, the International Conference on Population and Development, and it was in Cairo. And that was a conference where the whole world came to the conclusion or agreed that the individual right to plan your own family must be central to global development. So even before all of this, there was, a quite active just reproductive rights movement going on. However, this movement centered the issues of middle class, wealthy, cis white women. that they were represented the most in, media and conversations when they were when coming up with legislation and talking points. Those are the folks that were in mind, wealthy, middle class, cis white women. And because those are where the issues were focused at that time, these, Black women recognized that this framework couldn't adequately address the needs of Black women, women of color, um, lesbians, trans folks, other marginalized people, particularly of color. So they recognized that they needed a movement that centered the voices of marginalized women and their families, their communities, all of those great things. So at the time, they named themselves Women of African Descent for Reproductive Justice. And from that's where the framework, the theory, the term reproductive justice was born. And it merged the frameworks of reproductive rights and social justice and elevated it to a human rights issue. Like I said, reproductive justice is unique in that it makes these issues human rights issues that can't be challenged by, the Constitution or by interpretations of the Constitution. These are human rights issues. It looks outside the narrow scope of abortion rights and expands to address racism, sexism, classism, and more. So RJ, of course it includes abortion because that's part of having the right not to have a child, or even right to have a child or parent, children the way you want to. But RJ goes beyond that conversation and addresses why folks are having these systemic issues, include, why don't folks have access to food? Why don't folks have access to clean water in their communities? Why don't they have gynecological care in their communities? And why are these issues or these problems centered in predominantly Black or brown communities? We have to address the systems that make it so this is a reality. And it works to holistically address the needs of communities. So it doesn't stop, at the uterus, right? There's holistic health and wellness that reproductive justice is really good as a framework with addressing, making sure that whatever we're doing, it's coming from a place of care, right? And that means making sure that you're okay, making sure our folks are okay, not just, reproductively. I really didn't know another way to say that, but just okay. And this sort of just gives an easy to look at just graph of the differences between the three frameworks. I'm going to leave it on that for like a minute, just to give folks the opportunity. If you want to ask questions about anything that I've covered, you can do so now. If something came up for you, you can put it in the chat and I'll uplift that. So yeah, I'm just going to pause for a minute. Will we be given access to these slides? That's a good question. What we typically do, we don't necessarily give access to the slides, but we do have one pagers that we give folks access to. So we will have information that folks will be able to look at to sort of refer back, back to whatever they learned today. Are you comfortable / give consent to participants taking screenshots of the slides? Honestly, I would rather you not. This is Spark's intellectual property, and the last thing we want is our work to be, I don't know, taken, stolen, appropriated by an organization who isn't necessarily doing this work but wants, the cookies. So I would appreciate it if you didn't. And I apologize. I probably should have set that standard with our community agreements. Does Spark include Black folks inside POC? That's a good question. I don't think we have, or we've had discussions about, official terminology. I know when I bring up, Black folks or POC, I tend to separate the two. I don't know. I tend to uplift Black folks and then POC. I don't know if it's necessarily like the best way to address, these issues, but that's how I notice that I sort of navigate these terms, if that makes sense. And I hope that answers your question. Oh, safe. Yeah, absolutely. Great questions. All right, we're going to move on. Oh yeah, no, thank you for lifting that. I think that's a great point to make, and I feel like that's where I'm coming from when I sort of separate the two. So thank you for articulating that when I could not. All right. So Sparks' definition of reproductive justice, we define it as a social justice movement rooted in the belief that individuals and communities should have the resources and power to make sustainable and liberatory decisions about their bodies, genders, sexuality, and lives. It's pro sex, sexuality, queer bodies, access to abortion and contraception, birth rights and chosen families, and so much more. So that's how Spark sort of sees reproductive justice, and that's the spirit in which we move when we do reproductive justice work. It's similar to the general framework of just reproductive justice that's more widely known, but we take a step more just to include all of these other just facets and identities of people's lives. And then we bring in that power piece. Sorry, I wanted to uplift that. We bring in that power piece in the sense that RJ absolutely calls for folks to have access to resources. But what Spark does through, our leadership development programs, through creating spaces where folks can be in community together, can learn together, can maybe have access to the resources they need so they can do this work. We try to give them access to power, or help them find their power so they can do this work, so they can continue holding down, their communities, being leaders in their communities. So I definitely wanted to uplift that power piece. All right, and I'm going to move on. So now we're going to move on to queering, queerness. So I wanted to really start the conversation around queering reproductive justice by introducing some terms. Maybe some of you or most of you are already familiar with these terms, but I definitely wanted to um, have everyone start up on the same page as far as how I'll be defining the terms in this workshop. So yeah, I'm aware that most of you, at least have like a vague familiarity with the term, queer at least. But these are terms that they're not just rooted in lived or observed experiences. They're rooted in actual theory. Right. These are terms that didn't necessarily start off with, queer theory or anything like that, but there's actual theory and scholarship around queer the term queer, queerness, queering, or the act of queering. So I definitely wanted to honor that and to take a moment to define these terms before we started into the queering of RJ. And I provided some more key terms. So this part of the workshop, there's going to be some of these terms might come up particularly in this part of the workshop. I'll refer back to them at the end of the presentation just to make sure that I've defined or explained each of the terms, or if I haven't, I, I would give you the opportunity just to let me know so I can define or just, yeah, explain those terms. Just holding me accountable to that. So we're going to start with queering. So you might be thinking how's she going to define queering before we talk about just the word queer. Did I miss something? Is she getting ahead of yourself? Honestly, probably, but I'm going to do it anyway, and I'm going to tell you why. I think we need to understand queering, or quote, to queer as a verb, as an act, in order to contextualize queer as an identity. So as you can see in this definition, sorry, I got to move all of these windows around. Okay. So queering, or to queer, is challenging and eschewing the dominance of heterosexism and heteronormativity. So I've highlighted some of these terms that I included at the start of the presentation, or this section, just so I do have the opportunity to define them. So I define heterosexism as the marginalization and or oppression and or omission of people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, and or asexual, based on the belief that heterosexuality is the norm. So that's how I define heterosexism. And in that vein, I define heteronormativity as just the social setting and environment that normalizes heterosexuality. Are people clear sort of with that distinction? If the chat is quiet, I'll know to move on. Awesome. So I wanted to start with just the roots of queering. Where did it come from? Why is it a word? Why is it a thing? So queering is actually queer and reading shortened. It's a portmanteau of just queer and reading, which was something that was new to me. I really just thought it was applying queerness to, different things. I didn't realize it was actually just a combination of these words. It's a method that came from queer theory in the late 80s and 90s that challenged texts with heterosexuality or identity binaries. So yeah, it came forward as actually challenging texts, that reading piece, challenging these texts that centered heterosexuality, centered this concept of binaries, whether it's gender binaries, sexuality binaries, things like that. You're either gay or straight, what have you. And to define queer theory, it's a term that emerged in the late 1980s for a body of criticism on issues of gender, sexuality, and subjectivity that came out of gay and lesbian scholarship in such fields as literary criticism, politics, sociology, and history. It's a framework that acknowledges identities as social constructions. So it's a framework that recognizes that our identities aren't inherent. Our identities aren't, and because we have these identities, it doesn't mean that we are a certain way, we act a certain way, or we have to act a certain way. That all of sort of these rules, or norms that accompany sort of the identities that we hold are social constructions. So some notable queer theorists, we have Eve, I always mess this up, so bear with me. Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick, Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick, Judith Butler, Mikhail Foucault. Funny story, and this is absolutely an aside. I was a philosophy major in college, and my first philosophy course, Philosophy 101, not even Philosophy 101, it was Philosophy 100. And the first text we read was Mikhail Foucault, History of Sexuality. And I almost ran out of there screaming because I did not have the skills to engage in that work yet. Eventually, I leveled up, but that was wild. I do not know why my professor chose to start us off with that text. And E. Patrick Johnson. I know, right? What a starting text. Wild. And E. Patrick Johnson, Black queer theorist. Amazing. I have a couple of his books, actually. So, I sort of talked about, just the history of queering. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the act of queering, sort of suggesting what we mean when we're saying we're queering reproductive justice or queering anything, right? When we refer to, quote, queering something, we're actively challenging the heteronormative lens in which it's typically viewed. So, in addition to queering RJ, queering reproductive justice, there is absolutely no short supply of folks just queering things. It's low-key like a buzzword right now. You'll see books, papers, presentations, etc., where folks are queering things like medicine, race, media, um, queering heterosexuality. That's a thing that in my research I actually came across. It was kind of interesting. I couldn't get too deep into it, but it was really really interesting. So yeah, queering is something that can be applied to various frameworks, various pop culture, things like that. So yeah, it's definitely an act that we do. It's definitely a tool of analysis that we put on things. And I'm going to pause right here for questions or thoughts. Awesome. Okay. So I'm going to move on. So now we're actually going to get into the definition of queer. We started with queering, now we're going to back up to define queer or queerness. Let me do this. So queer and queerness act as both verb and adjective. So you can queer something, that is, quote, queering, and you can hold a queer identity. The word queer has just a long history of varied definitions, and I've sort of included them here. The last definition that I've written here, the last just explanation, is sort of my view of like a more modern or contemporary prevalent definition of queerness, and definitely open to be challenged on that in the chat if you have other just configurations or definitions of queerness. These are just things that came up for me. So starting out with queerness meaning just strange, peculiar, deviance from the norm. It used to be a very just, I guess, innocent adjective, right? And then it sort of morphed into a slur, a pejorative that referred to those who experience same sex attraction. It was a slur that was primarily at that time put onto men or men who were, perceived as gay. It moved on to be an, quote, umbrella term for folks who are not heterosexual or cisgender. And I wanted to be sure that I define those terms. Cisgender, meaning that a person who identifies with the gender they were assigned at birth. And then it morphed into a signifier of a gender and or sexual identity that actively, oh no, that's in the way. Maybe I'll stop. That actively deviates from heteronormativity and or cisnormativity. So defining just heteronormativity, I think I maybe defined that before, just the environment in which, heterosexuality is just normalized or regarded as the norm. And then applying that to cisnormativity, the environment in which being cisgender is recognized as the quote unquote norm. Oh, wait, actually, let me go back. So for the sake of this presentation, I know I established queer here as both verb and adjective, but we're sort of going to move through this presentation recognizing queer or queerness as more of an adjective, just to sort of help frame how we're going to be moving. So this is sort of a history of queer or queerness through the times, just a history of like literally the term. So it has its roots in the 18th century. It first came into pejorative use in the 19th century for men who were seen as quote flamboyant and men who engaged in quote sexual deviancy. And I can't remember the name of the man, the historical figure that they often cite as like the first person to refer to another person as queer in a pejorative. But yeah, they actually have his name out there. I really couldn't remember it. And honestly, I really didn't care to name him. Moving forward, it was adopted as a self-identifier by gay men who adopted quote masculine behavior in the early 20th century. So I really found that fascinating that it was used as a term to, I guess, separate some gay men from what they perceived as, I guess, the quote unquote like wrong way to be gay, or just to reaffirm their masculinity. So I know I'm not, gay, I'm not a homosexual, I'm queer, because look how strong and manly I am, which was just wild to me. I never thought of that being a thing. And I think right after this sort of definition of queer that was widely known, it was seen as a pejorative again in the 1940s. So it was sort of a step back into like a pejorative. So in the late 1980s, so I guess 40 years later, organizations like Queer Nation, radical organizations like Queer Nation at the time started reclaiming the term. I think we're all familiar just with the concept of reclaiming a term, taking away its power as a slur, and using that term to to that individual's identity's advantage. So them reclaiming this term is understood to be in response to just the larger LGBT community or movement adopting more conservative ideals and having more of like a dedication to assimilation. So you saw like just the wider movement talking about, you know, marriage, adoption, which I don't mean to like suggest these aren't like positive, amazing things, but you know, these were people who were very intentional about their radicalness and queering just relationships, right? What that looks like to be a family. So they sort of reclaimed queer to establish themselves as folks who are living in a more radical identity. And then, of course, queerness today has various meanings. Um, it's still it's still used to mean you know it's still used to mean strange, but like you know less frequently. There are people who still consider it a slur. Like there are legitimately people who still consider queer to be a pejorative. I've noticed. I feel like they're typically older. They've had that term used against them as a slur, you know, growing up. So I feel like you know that's completely valid. Um, but yeah, just that's folks' experiences. There are people who take queerness as a part of their politics. And of course, there are people where queerness just encompasses any non hetero or non cis identity. So before I move on, I guess it was another caveat, if you will. Um, I feel like defining just queer identity or what it means to be queer it's a bit tricky. And I don't really mean to suggest that folks who hold, you know, non-heteronormative identities are not valid in their queerness because they may identify a kind of way. It's definitely not my intention to like gatekeep or anything like that. What I really mean to suggest is that queerness really has no boundaries. It's kind of stretchy. It's constantly in flux in the way that it, as we can see, it's sort of constantly redefined. Though I feel like we can always go back to that root of just like you know strangeness, peculiarness, whatever. Um, but it really we really do sort of stretch our definition of queerness just based on the norms of the day. Systemic norms and oppressions of sex, sexuality, and gender, you know, those things are both apparent. You know, we very much see how they, you know, come out, and then they're also just insidious. So deviance from these norms in any way, I believe, can be considered as, you know, quote unquote queering them. And of course, I'm not putting that identity on anyone who, you know, doesn't want that to be their identity, but that's sort of where I landed on that. Um, so yeah, I'm going to pause to allow folks to ask questions, maybe make some comments in the chat. While y'all do that, I'll actually move on to the next slide, which is really just some reflection um, questions that came up for me as I was creating this presentation. And we're not necessarily going to get like deep into these questions or actually really address them, but I wanted y'all to just think about them. Like I don't have time to, you know, explore um, these questions, but as we move into, you know, the actual RJ of it all, I really want folks to think about queerness as it's defined as deviations from the norm and you know what that suggests for other identity categories. You know, as I put here, in the racist white supremacist society in which we live, what does queerness mean as it relates to racial identities? Are there ways of living that could be considered quote queer in one community and not in another? Is there a point where queering is no longer necessary or relevant? You know, is that where we reach liberation? Right. So I definitely wanted y'all to consider those questions. This is a slide that you can take a picture of, screenshot, take notes, whatever, because, you know, I feel like this is something I want people to walk away with. And again, I'm pausing for questions or just reflections in the chat. Well, thank you. Okay, so I hope we've had a little bit of time to reflect. Again, if anything comes up for you, please put it in the chat, and we're just gonna move forward. So, queer liberation, I wanted to dedicate a section, relatively short section, to this concept of queer liberation, because that's how Spark approaches reproductive justice through a lens of queer liberation. We combine these frameworks of queer liberation and reproductive justice to do this work. And I wanted to be sure to provide a definition of that, or my definition, or a working definition of queer liberation, because I've never necessarily been exposed to that. Um, and liberation, to a certain extent, is kind of subjective, right? My liberation might not look like your liberation, and we can talk about it, but it's like queerness, it's stretchy, right? And I wanted to provide sort of, or offer this definition or way of looking at queer liberation before we moved forward. So, queer liberation, by challenging the notion that gender and sexuality are part of a quote, essential self, and understanding that sex, gender, and sexuality are socially constructed, we can create a world where all people can make sustainable and liberatory decisions about our bodies, genders, sexualities, families, and lives holistically and without shame of fear rather of policing. So that's really my offering, of sort of a view of queer liberation and what we're working towards, what we're fighting for, right? I wanted to also take a minute to define essentialism. Essentialism is an approach assuming that people and things have natural and essential common characteristics which are inherent, innate, and unchanging. So I think I sort of referred to that concept without really naming it before. Just this belief, that because we have identities, because we were born to be perceived as a certain identity, we have sort of these preconceived traits about us. I think the more like widely known one is, women being just naturally more caring or caregiving, right? That's an essentialist view. And it gets, it can definitely get more, offensive and ridiculous. But this is sort of what we're combating, and what queerness and the act of queering sort of combats, is, this notion of essentialism. I think sort of the opposite of essentialism is this notion that our identities are these social constructions that don't really mean a thing. And of course, living in this society we live in right now, it does mean a thing, because we have to have those communities, because we are actually oppressed because of these societal based identities that have been put on us, or that we've had to encompass or inhabit rather, sorry, to survive. So I definitely wanted to offer that definition. Yoga pants 5. Yeah, it's stretchy. So now we're going to get into how we actually queer RJ. You join, this presentation, because it's called Queering RJ. I'm assuming you want to know how, we actually do it or what it actually means. So I want us, you know, forgive me, take another minute to reflect. We've explored the definition and act of queering. So what would that suggest for the way we queer RJ? And that's not necessarily rhetorical. You can maybe put like your initial thoughts in the chat. How do we look at reproductive justice outside of a heteronormative cis sexist lens? And then why is it important that we do this? So I'm gonna pause for reflection. Feel free to put any thoughts that come up for you in the chat. But yeah, just gonna take a minute. Absolutely. Not using gendered language when talking about repro issues. It's certainly how we do the work, the actual action of, queering RJ with that intentionality. Letting queer and trans people lead because we already do RJ work, period. That's it. Everyone go home. It's over. No, but like that's actually, how Spark queers RJ. And definitely thank you for uplifting that because, yeah, that's real. Queer and trans folks should be leading the work because they're the ones most impacted by these systems of oppression. And we'll get into it. But yes, thank you for uplifting that. RJ can sometimes have that white feminist vibe, so queering RJ makes RJ better. That's interesting. And I don't know. I don't want to necessarily like want to push back on that, but no, I feel no, that's fair. Because yeah, in RJ spaces, if there is a centering of just cis women, there's more conversations. Just like it's based just like around the uterus, cis women. We can't even be bothered to use pronouns correctly. Um, I think it's fair to recognize that act or that neglect as rooted in white supremacist ideals living in a white supremacist society. I feel like that's a fair point. My immediate, and I'll just be transparent, my immediate gut reaction was RJ is about Black women, it centers women of color. Why would you say that? But reflection, I feel like that could be a bit fair. Queer youth doing research and evaluating the current system. Absolutely. We're the experts of our own, experiences, but also it would be great if we got paid to do this research that people use to get funding for their org, for whatever for their institution, for their universities. Say that. How does RJ have white feminist vibes if it's created and led by Black people and other people of color? Yeah, like I said, that was sort of my immediate reaction. And I don't know if how I worked through it resonated with you. Um, but if it's, a conversation, you want to have, we do have the time to sort of engage in that. And I'm just going to go through before we do that, if that's what we want to do, I'm just going to make sure I don't leave out any questions. RJ, and I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with this term, identity politics. Got it. Figured it out. RJ, like identity politics and intersectionality, is appropriated by white feminists, non-disabled feminists, and cis feminists, etc. I don't know how to even combat that most times. That is definitely real. And I'll tell you that different iterations of this training of like RJ 101 were a bit more, I don't know, we're a bit more just clear about the fact that if you're not, led by Black women, doing the work and centering Black women, women of color, then you're not an RJ organization. To a certain extent, if you're not founded by Black women, you can't identify as an RJ organization. And it may be semantics, but as RJ as a framework is having a movement right now, one org that already has resources identifying as RJ is taking money away from more grassroots, smaller organizations who need that money and who are actually led by people of color, by women of color. So thank you for uplifting that. Yeah, that's that white supremacy creeping into Black movements. Falls in the same legacy of centering at the margins that the originators of RJ did in their context. Queer RJ is a more expansive RJ. Absolutely, that is beautifully said. RJ, reproductive justice being rooted in intersectionality, it only makes sense that it would be accepting or obvious or just obvious that we would queer RJ to sort of improve upon it, make it more expansive, as you said. Making sure that the queer and trans people leading are leading at all levels: doctors, nurse, heads of orgs, doulas, activists, etc., and removing the barriers to people becoming these things, right? There's definitely power in trying to think of the word, but yeah, just like power and having, like, whether it's these jobs or being able to do that kind of work, and there's actual barriers to being able to do that work. Pushing for gender inclusive competency from healthcare providers, and we'll touch on that a little bit moving forward. Remembering we ancestrally have ways to take care of our communities and pulling from those traditions that have whitewashed. Absolutely, absolutely. At the end of the day, we're the ones who are going to take care of ourselves. We're the one who are going to make sure we're good. And I'm like, no libertarian or anything like that, but it's real. Like, we rely on our communities for survival. And that goes back, just to our ancestors being able to take care of their communities because they didn't necessarily adhere to this white capitalist notion of the nuclear family. Like, our community is our family, and we take care of our family with all of our shared resources. Centering pleasure, community, and consent in our RJ praxis. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I definitely don't want to lose that. I think sometimes, and I'm definitely guilty of this, RJ can just turn into, just like, theory and talking about just the bad and all of, the things that we're combating. But yeah, like, let's focus on, let's center our pleasure, our joy, right? Community, and of course consent, and what that looks like, not just in sexual terms, or what we would consider, within consent. Like, consent doesn't just stop in the bedroom or start in the bedroom. So thank you for uplifting that. Whitewash and mainstream conversations. All right, yeah, acknowledgement. So maybe queering, it is more about taking it back to its roots. Maybe, yeah. I mean, holding it accountable. I feel like that would be a bit more accurate. Holding it accountable to its roots and itself as a framework. If you're really doing this work of, intersectionality, centering the margins, then the fact that we have to queer it shouldn't necessarily like be a thing. It shouldn't be something we have to do as more marginalized identities. I feel like consent gets completely disregarded in critical RJ discussion, and especially in reproductive healthcare itself. This includes creating processes within healthcare institutions for supporting survivors as they take care of themselves, and any little nuggets in gestation. inviting birth folks and their folks choose the language and rhetorics throughout the birthing process, and centering slash valuing slash prioritizing the pleasure, needs, and desire needed of folks needing RJ support. Absolutely, wonderfully said. I feel like, particularly in healthcare settings, settings can be the site of such violence and violations of consent. And that really just goes back to um, black black women being forced to have babies on a plantation, right? These settings are definitely, that's something that we have to challenge, and that's something that we mean when we, like, whether it's like queering these institutions. But yes, definitely centering consent in our analysis and how we challenge some of these systems and institutions. Queer RJ is a more decolonized RJ. Absolutely, absolutely. If we deplatform orgs, people, etc., who do not practice RJ, then that's accountability for me. I mean, hey, and I feel like it's absolutely fair to, like, of course, call them out, deplatform them, like, don't, like, encourage your folks not to donate to them. And that can be hard because, when all of when these orgs have more resources, they have more name recognition, and it's very easy to, like, go on TV and be like, I support this organization because I'm, a feminist. You can put on that identity just by saying you support that organization. Meanwhile, that organization gets more resources, gets more funding, gets more notoriety. Well, like I said, grassroots RJ organizations are still trying to, put, pinch pennies to make, to do the work. And not just organizations, because being an organization, that's also a place of privilege, but just, folks in community who are doing this work for free. They have to do it for free because the money is going to already privileged organizations or huge national organizations. So yeah, do what you can, challenge these folks. And thank you so much for this really just generative, amazing conversation. Um, and please feel free to continue, but I'm going to move on a bit. And we're still great on time. I'm just, like, looking at my slides, and yeah, we're still good on time if we're fitting within, like, this 2-hour workshop period. So yeah, I asked, how do we queer RJ? And then, we're going to get into how Spark specifically queers RJ. But I wanted to talk about, sort of why we do it. And y'all were already sort of making these points in the chat, right? Like, as you were saying it, I was like, wow, okay, present this for me. Why don't you? But yeah, y'all were uplifting these things. The queer and trans liberation movement and RJ are interwoven. They can't be separated because, as y'all have pointed out, you know, if RJ is living by its initial roots, if it's living by what it says as where it came from as far as, like, an intersectional analysis, then you can't really separate um, the movement towards queer and trans liberation from the goals and movement of reproductive justice. The goals of reproductive justice, as well as all social movements, won't be reached unless we center those who are most marginalized. Someone else, uplifted that we center the margins. Queer and trans folks need access to reproductive health care too. I mean, that's it. That's, why we do it. If we're gonna take it down to its, bare bones of, if reproductive justice is addressing access to, whatever it is we need to have children, not have children, parent children, bodily autonomy, what have you, queer and trans folks just need access to that too. And it looks different, getting access to that stuff than, cis and, heterosexual folks. So, as we've learned, RJ's roots are in challenging a narrative dominated by the voices of white, cis, rich, or middle class women. It's rooted in intersectionality, as we've said. And queerness should be integral within its framework. I mean, you would think and hope that was happening, um, but nah. Like I mean, I feel like there's been more of movement and intentionality around at least acknowledging that there need to be more conversations that center um, trans folks, gender non-binary folks in this space. And when I say center, it's not just okay, say your pronouns, or oh, them too, right? It actual centering their liberation in the process journey of getting everyone's liberation. um, Let me okay. So RJ and queer liberation are inseparable. I mean, that's what it comes down to. It You can't be doing the work of RJ if you're not mindful of queer liberation or centering queer liberation. Um, and it doesn't necessarily have to be just like the mission statement of your org, or written out in your value statement, or whatever. But that's where that's how you have to move. You have to move in the way that you're centering queer liberation. And that's just some of our base members. Sorry, there's a lag in the slide, so I'm going to wait till it changes before moving on. There we go. Okay, so how do we do it? How do we do it? We recognize that we must be willful and intentional about full inclusion of our communities. So intentionality is the key. It's like I said, it's not just acknowledging pronouns in a space, or just paying lip service to it once in a while. It's actual work. It's actual analysis. It's actually challenging the ways that we may be accustomed to moving, and it can be uncomfortable. It can be messy. Um, it can be just not, it doesn't necessarily have to be a fun experience, but through that journey, through those challenges, if it means coming to the end and you have this really good praxis of centering queer and trans folks, then it's worth it, because you are actually working towards the ultimate goal here. Like I said, it's work, and I will say this is how Spark queers RJ every day, like in our work, or strives to queer RJ in our work. Um, so inclusion of our communities, people of color, queer, trans, cis, gender nonconforming, all gender identities. Um, yeah, it centers all of these identities. We create space for intentional inclusivity, like Sparks RJ Leadership Camp, our fire camp, our annual fire camp for cutie POC, queer, trans, people of color, and cis Black women. So the picture that was before, let me see if I can go back. That was from one of our fire camps. Um, I'm not gonna derail and talk about what that is, because I definitely want to focus on the content. But yeah, fire camp is one of the ways where we center, we build up the leadership of queer and trans young people of color from throughout the Southeast. And we make it accessible, right? That's actually a big thing when it comes to intentionality. How do we make it accessible? Someone uplifted, you know, making things accessible for folks who live with disabilities. That's a thing that gets ignored some of the times. It's a thing that gets ignored, that we have to be mindful of and accountable to. As other ways of looking at accessibility, being able to fund folks to be in the space, being able to provide them with childcare if necessary, just creating a space where it's realistic that everyone you're trying to organize with or for can actually be in that space. So Spark actively approaches RJ through a queer and trans liberation lens. Um, we take sort of a twofold approach in how we sort of do this work. Um, Recognizing it's necessary to work on the immediate issues that dangerously impact our communities while also doing the work of systemic cultural change. So, yeah, it's twofold, like what's going on in our communities right now? What do folks need? What resources can we, provide for them? And Spark isn't necessarily like a direct service organization or, a reproductive health organization, but particularly during, this um, the COVID-19 pandemic, we've been trying to be a bit more intentional or creative in the way we're supporting folks, whether it's we get funding, we just going to provide mutual aid funds for folks. No questions asked, you need some money here. And we've done that a couple of times this summer and the start of this fall. And that's great. I'm proud I'm part of an organization who can just do that. Just here's some money. You're struggling, here's some money. And I really appreciate it, and I really feel like it's part of the work, getting people access to resources, um, and then of course also doing that work of systemic cultural change, whatever it looks like, whether it's at traditional, like just legislative advocacy, civic engagement, though we can have that conversation, doing that kind of work, but also cultural change, education, like political education sessions, making it so that these issues that we talk about constantly aren't necessarily like, what's the word I'm looking for? It doesn't come just naturally to some people who are just living in a society that is, racist, transphobic, homophobic. These systems that make it seem like anything out of this, normative is, deviant, or we should be keeping them over there, down, whatever. Um, some of these concepts that we take advantage of the fact that we can talk about them consistently. They just don't come naturally to people, and I'm not using that sort of as like an excuse for bigotry or anything like that, because you know most of the people you hear, they can pick up a book, they can use the Google, they have access to this information, but I definitely wanted to also just uplift that part of the work of cultural change is opening folks' eyes to other realities, um, opening folks' eyes of what could be and why that helps everyone in the long run. And then we, of course, we do this with by shifting our language. We have to understand how cis-centered language can isolate queer and trans people from the conversation and the movement. We, Spark as an organization, have shown up in plenty of spaces where they at the beginning of the meeting, everyone says their pronouns, and then pronouns aren't respected for the rest of the meeting, and that's isolating. That pulls our base members out of like the space. It pulls our staff members out of the space because they can't engage when that's violence being perpetuated against them. Terms used by our communities: YPOC, young people of color; cutie POC, as I've said, queer, trans people of color. And then some of like these other terms that come up based on just the conversation that's being had: people who have penises, people who have a vagina, people with a uterus or can physically carry a child / have the ability to get pregnant, people with the ability to create sperm. Some of these, just descriptive terms that, that coincide with just a conversation or a particular situation. people with one or the other, and people with both. And we remain aware of this, especially in our outreach, our advocacy, our organizing, and our messaging. When we're sending out public statements against harmful bills in the Georgia legislature, and I'm actually, yeah, speaking specifically about, HB 481 in Georgia, the 6-week abortion ban, sending out public statements that don't just say, doesn't just mention women, right? That acknowledges that these are bills and policies that actually harm trans men, non-binary folks, um, lesbian, all of these other identities that are seen as not, quote unquote, not the norm, or queer. And we have to be intentional about that in that language. It doesn't matter if, the good old boy from, backwater Georgia doesn't understand why we don't just say woman in the legislature. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, that's how we start having conversations, or start having them, you know, having conversation that is not just, these aren't issues that just impact cis women. All right, and I'm gonna do this slide, and then I'm gonna pause again for questions and discussion. So Sparks strategies, um, recognizing that long-term systemic change requires building new leadership from marginalized communities and educational programs designed to shift culture. So someone already uplifted that having queer and trans non-binary folks leading the movement is what we need to do to move the work. Having them lead the movement and having them paid for, leading this movement, that's what needs to happen. And then educational programs designed to shift culture, changing the way people perceive queerness, changing the way people perceive trans identities. So you said birthing people is another term when speaking specifically about birth-related services and experiences. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's, another term, and I'm probably gonna eventually just like include that in the slide. There are like a lot more terms we can use to refer to people that doesn't center their gender. Our strategies are informed by our location in the South, where progressive agendas are often under assault by conservative opposition. And that's real, but there's a lot of just great organizing in the South. I mean, we saw that from, this last election where, at first people, progressive blue states, they gave up on Georgia. They weren't thinking about Georgia. Georgia was just like this state that would always vote against its own good and stuff like that. It was red, but actual organizing, organizing from Black women leading that work, um, you know, made it so that the election turned out a way that people weren't expecting. Not trying to be partisan, but that's real. It was actually, Black women leading this work and organizing that shifted the landscape of Georgia so that more people had access to the ballot, more people could vote. And they mad about it. We must create our own models of organizing that are distinct and different from organizations and more progressive political climates, because that's real. How we organize here in Georgia is going to be completely different than how orgs in like Washington State, Oregon, or California, even, it's going to be different from how they organize, which, doesn't take away from the validity of either of our methods, but it's different and we have to recognize that. So going to take another pause for folks to ask questions or engage in the chat if you choose to. All right. Yeah, I had to mute myself a little bit as I took a swig of my water. All right, we can move forward. So centering trans and gender nonconforming folks. Definitely wanted to dedicate a specific section to this, um, because yeah, we can talk about like queering and what it means to be queer, but I think we do ourselves a disservice when we don't uplift um, the issues and the oppressions that trans and gender nonconforming folks, particularly of color, particularly Black, rather, experience on the daily. So why is it necessary? Trans and gender nonconforming folks are erased in many RJ spaces. We've talked about this. Trans folks face disproportionate experiences of poor health outcomes, and that's because of these systemic barriers and oppressions. And I'm actually going to put a link in the chat to Spark's 2020 policy report, health policy report, that sort of gives just a rundown of the disparate health outcomes of trans and gender nonconforming folks in the state of Georgia because they have to navigate discrimination, transphobia, oppression. So I'm going to put that in the chat. Folks are welcome to download that, look at it, engage with it. RJ requires an intersectional approach wherein we can't ignore how interconnected systemic oppressions of race, gender, and class impacts health outcomes. You're not doing the work if you don't acknowledge this, because then you're not working towards actual liberation. Someone's going to get left behind. So these are just some reproductive oppressions that we wanted to uplift, to really just give examples of like just the oppressions that trans folks face, receiving just like reproductive health care, or from like a reproductive justice standpoint. I think it makes it like more real for folks because we can like say it, but there's actually like these are actual situations where it comes up for people. Just gonna give space for folks to look that over, engage with it if you want. But like I said, I mean, it trans men and gender nonconforming folks, and trans women, those are the folks who need to be centered in our movements. And I'm gonna back up and say, Black trans women, Black trans men, Black gender nonconforming folks, these are the folks who need to be centered in our RJ movements. There are systemic and institutional barriers to trans folks accessing and receiving healthcare. Healthcare shouldn't come with violence. Healthcare shouldn't come with, your doctor knowing less about how to, knowing less about how to like heal your body than like you do in that moment, right? They are impacted by stigma and discrimination perpetuated by institutional and structural systems. We recognize that trans men face just difficulty finding reproductive health care, finding just gender affirming health care. And then, cost is prohibitive as well. Insurance doesn't cover hormone therapy. Insurance doesn't cover in vitro a lot of the times. And insurance doesn't cover wanting to freeze your eggs or your sperm, right? And that is, it's expensive. It is expensive. And it's part of just wanting to, have children, or wanting to provide yourself with that choice to have children, if you want. but it's a barrier and systemic barrier that there are these extra costs to it. And of course, healthcare should be free anyways, but as it is now, that's another barrier. Um, we have discrimination that's codified with RFRA bills, RFRA being Religious Freedom and Restoration Act bills, where it's basically just giving folks the ability to discriminate against queer, trans, Black, just any individual who they feel they would like to discriminate against because it's, part of their religion, or they can give like a religious exemption. We see that through, and no Medicaid expansion as well. Georgia does not have Medicaid expansion, and healthcare is ridiculously expensive. Georgia has made the healthcare marketplace through the Affordable Care Act almost impossible to not access, because it's still there, but they're chipping away at it. And I can get into sort of like the waivers a bit, but I honestly I'm not as knowledgeable about it to talk about it. But yeah, just making it so that healthcare costs are more expensive, or healthcare is just more difficult to access. Assisted reproductive technologies, like I said, prohibitively expensive. Um, Talking about just like imprisonment and trans bodies, um, being placed in prison in and of itself is just against our own bodily autonomy, or just against our humanity, right? You know, not putting people in cages would be the solution to all of this. But in the meantime, solitary confinement is not a solution to jailing like trans folks. Putting them in the population that is not their gender identity is not how you navigate having trans folks in your jails and prisons. And ultimately, the systemic change we want is, prisons not being a thing, or jails not being a thing, speaking from me and Spark's, perspective, or values. But yeah, in the meantime, as far as, I don't know, for lack of a better just term or phrase, harm reduction, you there needs to be better ways to for trans folks to navigate the jail system. And it's weird to say for trans folks to be in jail, like no, but if we have to have these environments in place, they need to be more, they need to be safer. And someone uplifted, safe uplifted, trans masculine on hormones are often even flat out turned away at places that offer gynecological care because they are assumed to not have uteruses. Absolutely. Absolutely. Which is wild, which goes back to essentialism, right? It goes back to being, if you like, they will perceive someone as not having a uterus or not being able to access their services based on how they're presenting. And I don't want to like derail or anything like that, but that impacts, cis folks as well. There are plenty of cis folks who don't express themselves, do not have a gender normative expression, and can be misinterpreted to like another gender identity, and that that's, they have to navigate that as well. So that's definitely real safe. Thank you for uplifting that. That the fact that folks are turned away from access to healthcare because of how, because of their identities, because of how they present. So Spark also, we try to invest in trans leadership. I've talked a bit about this. It's important that we invest in and empower trans folks of color. We must cultivate communities. We must strive to bridge the gap between the disparate health and wellness outcomes between cis and trans folks. And there's intentionality behind that work that Spark does, providing folks with the resources they need to just show up for the work. that's just, that should just be base level. In a transphobic, cis sexist world, transphobes often have to rely on their chosen families and their chosen communities to survive. Um, and I feel like we have to create spaces where these communities can be cultivated, shift the culture so that we are part of communities, and we are active part of communities, so we are taking care of each other. All right, so coming to the end here. So I'm going to go back to these key terms again, sort of like as an accountability practice. Um, I hope I defined all of these terms, or if I didn't define them, I hope they were terms that folks um, like knew of, understood. But if not, please put in the chat and I'd be happy to define some of these terms. Okay. So that's it. I mean, thank you so much for coming, choosing to be at a Queering RJ session. I hope you got a lot out of it. I hope you were able to learn something. Thank you for engaging. I loved all of like the conversations that were happening in the chat. Thank you to our interpreters. Thank you to our note taker. Very much appreciate y'all's work and y'all being in this space. And yeah, I'm really just going to end it with, if anyone has, if the slide would change. Yeah. If anyone has any questions, just lingering questions or thoughts, we have a little bit of time, and I'll stay in this space for you to ask those questions or engage. Maybe I'll, if it's like maybe a few of us, I can take you off mute and we can just like talk. But yeah, I hope y'all have a great rest of your day. If you do choose to, exit, like I said, free leave. But yeah, thank you so much for being in this space. And that's it for me, y'all. And if you want to learn more about Spark, here are our socials.